Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. I want to tell you about a morning that changed everything. Picture this. It's 5:43 a.m. on what seems like an ordinary Tuesday, somewhere in California's Central Valley. The sun hasn't quite crested the horizon yet, painting the sky that soft orange pink that makes even the most industrial landscape look magical for a few precious minutes. Maria Gonzalez pulls her beat-up Ford pickup into the gravel driveway of her first apiary stop of the day. She's been doing this for 23 years, checking on her bee colonies, making sure they're healthy, productive, ready for another day of the work that quite literally keeps our world running. Her coffee is still steaming in the truck's cup holder, that first sip still warming her throat. Maria steps out of the cab and immediately knows something is wrong. You know that feeling you get sometimes, when the air itself feels different, like right before a thunderstorm, when even the birds go quiet? That's what hits her first, the silence. Now, if you've never been around commercial beehives, let me paint you a picture of what 5:43 a.m. normally sounds like. Even in the cool morning air, even before the sun fully rises, 200 white wooden boxes should be creating this low, constant hum. It's not loud exactly, but it's there. This thriving, living sound that tells you 60,000 tiny workers in each hive are already starting their day. Some are cleaning house, some are feeding larvae, some are getting ready to head out on the day's first foraging runs. But this morning, nothing. Not the temporary quiet you might expect from cool air slowing the bees down. This is something deeper, something that makes the hair on Maria's arms stand up. She approaches the first hive, her boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. The entrance, that should show bees coming and going even at this early hour, is still. She lifts the lid, something she's done thousands of times, and peers inside. 60,000 bodies lie perfectly still. Each bee looks perfect, unmarked, as if they simply decided to stop. No signs of disease, no evidence of predators, no mites, no fungus, no obvious toxins. They just stopped. All of them. At the same time. Maria's hands shake as she checks the next hive, then the next, then the next. 200 colonies, 12 million bees, all gone. By 7 a.m., Maria's phone starts ringing. Other beekeepers across California, then Oregon, then Texas. By noon, her phone won't stop ringing, and neither will anyone else's in the pollination business. The calls are coming from everywhere: Canada, Mexico, Argentina, New Zealand, Kenya, Thailand. The same impossible story, repeated in dozens of languages. The bees are gone, all of them, everywhere. Now, I know what you're thinking. How is that even possible? How does an entire group of animals just disappear? Well, here's the thing, and this is going to sound crazy. But stay with me, this isn't the first time it's happened. Not globally, but locally, in smaller areas, we've seen previews of exactly this scenario. Let me take you to China's Sichuan province in the 1980s. Beautiful region, famous for its pear orchards that have been cultivated for over 2,000 years. But in their push to maximize yields, farmers began using pesticides heavily, really heavily. And you know what happened? The wild bees disappeared, not gradually, relatively quickly, over just a few years. So what did they do? They adapted. Every spring now, 30,000 people, 30,000, climb ladders with brushes made from chopsticks and cigarette filters. They hand-pollinate pear blossoms, one person doing the work that 3 bee colonies used to do effortlessly. It takes them weeks to accomplish what the bees did naturally in days. Think about that for a second. Picture yourself with a tiny brush, climbing from tree to tree, touching each individual flower. That's what humans do when the ancient partnership breaks down. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and tell you about this partnership, because it's one of the most incredible stories in the history of life on Earth. 100 million years ago, we're talking about when dinosaurs still ruled the planet, flowering plants and bees struck a deal. Not consciously, of course, but through the slow, patient work of evolution. The plants said, essentially, "We'll give you sweet nectar and protein-rich pollen," and the bees said, "We'll carry your genetic material from flower to flower, helping you reproduce." It was a handshake deal written in DNA, and it created the world we know today. Here's the wild part. 75% of our food crops depend on this partnership. 75%. And when you look at wild plants, the percentage jumps to 90%. We're talking about 400,000 species of flowers that evolved specifically to attract bees. The co-evolution between plants and bees is so intricate, so beautiful, it almost seems designed. Some orchids literally shape themselves to look like female bees, complete with fuzzy textures and bee-like coloring. The male bees try to mate with the flower and end up covered in pollen. It's sexual deception on a botanical level, and it works perfectly. Other flowers developed landing strips that are only visible in ultraviolet light, a light that bees can see but we can't. Imagine tiny airplane runways painted on petals, guiding bees to exactly the right spot for maximum pollen transfer. And then there are the flowers that grew into intricate tubes, each species with a different depth, each one matching the exact tongue length of their particular bee partner. The ghost orchid has a tube 7 inches deep, and there's exactly one species of bee with a 7-inch tongue that can reach its nectar. One flower, one bee, locked in an evolutionary dance that's been going on for millions of years. But now, in our imaginary morning that feels all too possible, the dance partners are gone. Think about what Maria is witnessing as she stands there in that California apiary. She's seeing the end of a contract that predates human civilization by millions of years. The end of a partnership so fundamental to life on Earth that we barely notice it, like gravity or air pressure, until it's gone. And here's what happens next. In China's Sichuan province, they know. They've been living in the aftertime since the 1987 when their wild bees vanished. Every spring brings the same desperate ritual. 30,000 people with ladders, brushes, and hope. One person replacing 3 entire bee colonies. The work that evolution perfected over eons, humans attempt with sticks and prayer. The economics are brutal. Those hand-pollinated pears cost 5 times more to produce than bee-pollinated ones. What used to be free, the work of bees, now requires armies of human workers. The labor alone costs more than the final crop is worth. But it's not just about money. A bee visiting a flower doesn't just drop off pollen randomly. She's an expert. Her body carries up to 10 million tiny, electrically charged hairs. When she approaches a flower, the pollen literally jumps onto her like iron filings to a magnet. As she pushes deep into the bloom, drinking nectar, her fuzzy body brushes against the flower's reproductive parts with perfect precision. A human with a brush? We're trying to replicate millions of years of evolution with craft store supplies. But let's get back to Maria's morning, because the story is just beginning. By the time the sun sets on this impossible day, the calls have been coming in from every continent. Not just honeybees, those are the ones most people think of. We're talking about 20,000 species of bees, the tiny sweat bees that pollinate wildflowers, the chunky bumblebees that are the only ones strong enough to buzz-pollinate tomatoes, the leafcutter bees that nest in hollow stems, the mining bees that burrow underground, the mason bees that are 200 times more efficient at pollinating fruit trees than honeybees. All gone. In one morning. Everywhere. The immediate silence is eerie enough, but the real terror is in what comes next. Because this isn't just about losing honey. This is about the unraveling of the most important ecological partnership in the history of complex life on Earth. You see, bees don't just visit flowers randomly. Each species has evolved alongside specific plants. Some relationships are so tight, so exclusive, that if one partner disappears, the other dies too. It's like losing half of a conversation that's been going on for millions of years. That patch of wildflowers you drive past every day, gone in one generation without bees. The berry bushes that bears depend on to fatten up before winter. They'll flower once more, then never again. The fruit trees in orchards from Washington to New Zealand, they'll bloom beautifully this spring, then stand barren forever. But here's what really should keep you awake at night. We're not just imagining this scenario. We're already living the beginning of it. Right now, as I'm talking to you, 40% of bee species are facing extinction. 40%. Colony collapse disorder, which scientists first identified in 2006, is causing entire hives to vanish overnight. The symptoms are exactly what Maria found in our story. Bees that look perfect but are simply gone. The causes are everywhere. Pesticides that turn flower nectar into nerve poison. Parasitic mites that spread viruses while literally sucking bees dry. But the biggest killer might be the simplest one. We've simplified the landscape so much that bees are starving in a land of plenty, where diverse prairies once bloomed. From March through November, we've planted mile after mile of single crops. A bee needs 50 different types of flowers for complete nutrition. Modern agriculture offers one crop for miles. It's like asking a human to survive on white bread alone. Possible for a while, but ultimately catastrophic. The solutions exist, and some of them are surprisingly simple. In Oslo, Norway, they've created the world's first bee highway, the corridor of rooftop gardens and flower strips that runs right through the city, giving bees a continuous path of food and shelter. In Detroit, abandoned lots are being transformed into pollinator paradises, but we're racing against time. Unlike our fictional tomorrow morning, today still hums with possibility. The ancient partnership between flowers and bees continues, fragile but not yet broken. The question is, what happens next? Will we wake up one morning to silence, or will we act while the humming continues? In the next part of our story, I want to show you exactly what that silence would mean, not just for bees, but for everything. The cascading collapse that would reshape our planet in ways we're only beginning to understand. Because once the clockwork of nature stops, getting it started again isn't just difficult. It might be impossible. Picture a bee approaching an apple blossom on what would have been just another spring morning. She's about half an inch long, weighs less than a paperclip, but she's carrying out one of the most sophisticated operations in nature. Her body is covered in 10 million static charged hairs, not smooth like human hair, but branched and feathery, designed by millions of years of evolution to be the perfect pollen collection system. As she approaches the flower, something incredible happens. The pollen literally jumps onto her like iron filings attracted to a magnet. The static charge her body builds up during flight creates an electrical field that pulls pollen grains right off the flower's anthers. She doesn't even have to touch them. They leap through the air to stick to her fuzzy body. But here's where it gets really amazing. As she pushes deeper into the flower, following the ultraviolet landing strips that guide her to the nectar, her abdomen brushes against the stigma, her farva, the flower's female reproductive part. Some of those millions of pollen grains transfer from her body to the flower. Within hours, chemical signals cascade through the plant. The fertilized flower begins its transformation into fruit. It's an intimate dance of survival, played out in gardens and orchards and wild meadows across the world. One bee, one flower, one moment of contact that creates the apple you might have for lunch. Now multiply this by 7 trillion. That's not a typo. 7 trillion bee visits are needed every year just for America's crops. Let that sink in for a moment. 7 trillion individual acts of pollination, each one as precise and essential as a surgeon's cut. Take almonds, for instance. California produces 80% of the world's almonds, and every single one of those nuts exists because a bee visited the flower it came from. The almond orchards covering 800,000 acres need 60 billion flower visits each February when the trees bloom. 60 billion. Commercial beekeepers truck in 2 million hives from across the country, creating the largest annual migration of livestock in the world. But in our silent mourning, those trucks arrive to find empty orchards. The trees bloom magnificently, pink and white flowers stretching to the horizon like a fairy tale landscape. But no humming, no movement, just beautiful doomed flowers that will drop to the ground in a week, unfertilized. Here's what happens next, and it's not pretty. Day 1. Nothing visible changes. The flowers are still there, still beautiful, still producing nectar that now has no purpose. Farmers walk through their orchards in stunned silence, the absence of sound more terrifying than any storm. Day 7. The first petals begin to fall. In a normal year, these would be petals falling from flowers that have been pollinated, ready to begin developing fruit. But these are different. These are the petals of flowers that waited for visitors that never came. They fall like snow, carpeting the ground with the remnants of crops that will never be. Day 30. The catastrophe becomes undeniable. Fruit trees across the world stand leafy and green but completely barren. No tiny apples swelling on the branches. No baby peaches fuzzy with promise. Just leaves and wood where fruit should be forming. And the ripple effects? They start immediately and spread like cracks in ice. The Midwest's pumpkin fields, which produce 75% of the world's pumpkins, produce nothing. Halloween becomes a holiday without Jack-O. Lanterns, but that's just the beginning. The Southeast's watermelon farms, New England's cranberry bogs, Florida's citrus groves, all dependent on bees, all suddenly useless. But here's where it gets really scary. Even crops that don't need bee pollination start to suffer. You see, cattle feed on alfalfa, and alfalfa needs bees. Chickens eat soybeans, and soybeans need bees. Our entire agricultural web is connected through these tiny insects that most people never think about. Let me walk you through what happens to just one farm, a dairy operation in Wisconsin. The farmer, let's call him Tom, doesn't grow anything that directly needs bee pollination. His corn is wind-pollinated, his grass grows fine without bees, but his cows eat alfalfa hay, and alfalfa absolutely requires bee pollination to produce seed for next year's crop. Within 6 months, Tom can't buy alfalfa seed at any price. The fields that have grown alfalfa for generations can't be replanted. His cattle, bred for milk production on high-protein feed, can't survive on grass alone. Milk production plummets. Tom, whose family has farmed that land for 4 generations, faces bankruptcy. Multiply Tom's story by every dairy farm, every beef operation, every chicken farm that depends on bee-pollinated feed crops. The collapse spreads through the agricultural system like dominoes falling in slow motion. But wait, it gets worse. Because we haven't even talked about what happens to wild ecosystems yet. Beyond the farms, in the forests and meadows and prairies, something even more devastating unfolds. That patch of wildflowers you love to see blooming along the highway every spring, it's about to become a ghost landscape. 20,000 plant species co-evolved so tightly with specific bees that they can't reproduce any other way. It's not that they prefer bees, it's that they literally cannot survive without them. The ghost orchid I mentioned earlier, with its 7-inch nectar tube, there's exactly one species of bee with a tongue long enough to reach its nectar. No substitutes, no alternatives, no bee, no orchid, ever. The partridge pea, which creates nitrogen in the soil and prevents erosion across millions of acres, can only be pollinated by a specific type of sweat bee. The wild blueberries that feed everything from bears to birds require buzz pollination, a technique only bumblebees can perform. They grab onto the flower and vibrate their flight muscles without moving their wings, shaking pollen loose like salt from a shaker. Within one generation, just one, these plants vanish from landscapes where they've grown for millions of years. And when the plants go, everything that depends on them follows. Picture this. You're walking through what used to be a wildflower meadow 1 year after the bees disappeared. The grasses are still there, they're wind-pollinated, but everything else is gone. No black-eyed Susans, no purple coneflowers, no wild bergamot, just grass and weeds stretching to the horizon. It's like someone drained all the colour from the world. The soil itself begins to change. Plants like clover and vetch, which pull nitrogen from the air and feed it to the soil, need bees to reproduce. Without them, the nitrogen cycle breaks down. Meadows that built topsoil for millennia become erosion zones. The earth itself becomes less fertile, less alive. In tropical rainforests, the disaster amplifies. The layered architecture of the canopy, that incredible three-dimensional world of life, depends on hundreds of bee-pollinated tree species. When these trees can't reproduce, gaps in the canopy don't heal. Pioneer species that normally colonize clearings can't establish because they too need bee pollination. The forest literally stops regenerating itself. Think about the Brazil nut. It's one of the most valuable tree crops in the Amazon, supporting thousands of indigenous families. But Brazil nut trees can only be pollinated by one species of orchid bee, a large iridescent insect that's strong enough to force open the tree's complicated flowers. No orchid bee, no Brazil nuts. Ever. The tree will live for another 500 years, but it will never reproduce again. It becomes a living fossil, the last of its genetic line. Now, let's talk about the animals. Because when the plants can't reproduce, everything that eats them faces starvation. The ruby-throated hummingbird times its spring migration to the blooming of bee-pollinated trumpet flowers. The birds fly non-stop across the Gulf of Mexico, burning half their body weight in the crossing, betting their lives that flowers will be waiting on the other side. But the flowers that were supposed to bloom never developed because the bees that were supposed to pollinate them last year were gone. Thousands of hummingbirds arrive to find nothing. They fall from the sky like tiny jeweled raindrops. In Alaska, grizzly bears emerge from hibernation, counting on blueberry bushes that flowered but never fruited. A mother bear, already thin from months without food, finds empty bushes where her cubs should have, fattened before the next winter. Calorie-deprived and desperate, she makes the heartbreaking decision to abandon her cubs. They can't all survive on the few remaining food sources, but it's not just the obvious connections. In Africa, elephants depend on marula fruit to get through the dry season. The trees bloom magnificently without bees, but the flowers drop without forming fruit. Elephants, already stressed by habitat loss and poaching, face starvation in landscapes that should be abundant. The ripple effects spread through food webs like shockwaves. Fruit bats across the tropics, which pollinate plants and disperse seeds, lose their food sources and crash in population. The plants they would have pollinated, the few that don't need bees, lose their pollinators too. It's a cascade of extinction spreading outward from that silent morning when the bees disappeared. Even predators feel the loss. Hawks that hunt the small birds that eat seeds from bee-pollinated plants watch their prey disappear. Wolves that depend on deer that browse on bee-pollinated shrubs find their hunting grounds empty. The numbers are staggering. 1,600 vertebrate species depend directly on bee-pollinated plants. When you add in the secondary effects, ANS, predators losing prey, decomposers losing organic matter, seed dispersers losing fruit, We're talking about reshaping entire ecosystems. But here's the most terrifying part. This isn't speculation. It's already happening in small pockets around the world, giving us previews of the global catastrophe. On Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean, the introduction of non-native ants eliminated the native bee populations in the 1970s. Within 20 years, the island's native plant communities collapsed. Where once there were 43 species of native flowering plants, now there are fewer than 10. The rest exist only in greenhouse conservation programs. In parts of Europe, industrial agriculture has created bee deserts, vast monocultures where native bees have vanished. In these areas, wild plant diversity has dropped by 60% in just 50 years. The landscape is turning into something flat and monotonous, like a botanical wasteland. And remember, we're still in the early stages of our imaginary catastrophe. We're talking about the immediate ecological effects. But there are secondary and tertiary effects that won't show up for years or even decades. Forests don't just lose individual tree species, they lose their ability to adapt to climate change. The genetic diversity that comes from sexual reproduction, facilitated by bees, is what allows plant populations to evolve and survive changing conditions. Without bees, plants become evolutionary dead ends, unable to adapt to droughts, diseases, or shifting temperatures. The nitrogen cycle, fundamental to all life on Earth, begins to break down as nitrogen-fixing plants disappear. Soil fertility crashes across the planet. Even wind-pollinated crops like wheat and corn begin to struggle in depleted soils. But we haven't talked about the human response yet, because while ecosystems collapse and food webs unravel, humanity won't just sit quietly and accept starvation. We'll fight back with everything we have. The question is, can human technology and ingenuity replace 100 million years of evolution? Can we rebuild the clockwork of nature with machines and desperation? That's where our story goes next, into the labs and greenhouses and desperate innovation centers where humanity races against time to replace the irreplaceable, where we discover just how much we took for granted and how little we understood about the tiny insects that kept our world running. The bees are gone, the flowers are falling, and now it's up to us to figure out what comes next. Week 3, without bees. If you've ever been in a supermarket during a natural disaster, a hurricane warning maybe, or the start of a pandemic, you know that particular feeling of walking through aisles that should be full but aren't. Empty shelves wrapped in apologetic yellow tape. Signs everywhere. Temporarily unavailable. Supply chain issues. We apologize for the inconvenience. But this is different. This isn't temporary, and deep down, everyone knows it. The produce sections look like crime scenes. First, the stone fruits disappeared. Peaches, plums, cherries. People didn't panic initially, because hey, it's not stone fruit season anyway, right? Then the berries vanished from the frozen food aisles. Still, no real alarm. Berries are expensive luxury items for most families. But when the apples disappeared, that's when reality hit. Apples are supposed to be everywhere, all year round. They're the most basic fruit, the one kids pack in lunchboxes, the one that keeps doctors away. When there are no apples anywhere at any price, people start to understand the magnitude of what's happening. Now the melon sections stand empty, the squash bins sit bare. Even the organic section, with its higher prices and smaller selection, has nothing but root vegetables and leafy greens. Potatoes, carrots, onions, cabbage, spinach, TV, the wind-pollinated and self-pollinating survivors of agricultural catastrophe. But here's what most people don't realize yet. The empty shelves are just the visible tip of an iceberg that goes much, much deeper. Sarah Martinez runs a small restaurant in Austin, Texas. 3 weeks ago, her menu featured 27 different dishes. This week, she's down to 8, and half of those are different preparations of potatoes. She can't get tomatoes at any price, Turns out they need buzz pollination from bumblebees. No peppers, no eggplant, no squash for her famous butternut squash soup. But it's not just the obvious bee-dependent crops. Her chicken supplier called yesterday to warn that prices are going up 400%. Because chickens eat soybeans, and soybean seed production requires bee pollination. The existing soybean crop will last maybe 6 months, then there won't be any more. Ever. Sarah stares at her walk-in cooler, trying to figure out how to run a restaurant with 8 ingredients. Potatoes, onions, carrots, beef, chicken while it lasts. Wheat flour, rice, and leafy greens. She's gone from being a chef to being a food chemist, trying to create variety from scarcity. But the real catastrophe isn't happening in restaurants or supermarkets. It's happening in places most people never see, in migration routes and breeding grounds and hibernation sites thousands of miles from any human. In Mexico's Sierra Madre Mountains, the monarch butterflies are dying. Every year, 100 million monarchs make an incredible journey from Canada to Mexico, traveling up to 3,000 miles to spend the winter in a handful of mountain forests. It's one of the most spectacular migrations on Earth. Time, a river of orange and black flowing across an entire continent. But the butterflies time their journey to feed on wildflowers along the route. They need nectar every few hundred miles to fuel their flight. The flowers they depend on, goldenrod, asters, milkweed, all require bee pollination to produce the seeds for next year's plants. This year, the monarchs arrived to find nothing. The plants bloomed last spring, but without bees, they produced no seeds. The meadows that have fed migrating butterflies for millions of years are brown and empty. The butterflies, already exhausted from their impossible journey, have nowhere to refuel. Park rangers in Mexico find orange and black wings scattered across the forest floor like autumn leaves. 100 million butterflies, victims of a catastrophe that happened thousands of miles away. But it's not just insects. In Alaska, something heartbreaking is happening in the wilderness. Grizzly bears emerge from hibernation in a state of controlled starvation. They've burned half their body, weight through the winter, and their survival depends on the spring and summer feeding bonanza that allows them to regain weight before the next hibernation. Blueberries are crucial to their diet. A single bear can eat 40,000 berries in a day during peak season. But this year, the blueberry bushes produced flowers and nothing else. The plants are still alive, still healthy, but they couldn't set fruit without their bee pollinators. Where once there were berries carpeting the forest floor, there's nothing. A mother bear named Ursa, though of course she has no name in the wild, faces an impossible choice. She emerged from the den with 2 cubs, born during hibernation. In a normal year, she would lead them to berry patches, salmon runs, and other food sources, teaching them how to survive while building up her own reserves for next year's pregnancy and hibernation. But there are no berries. The salmon runs are diminished because the bears that usually bring marine nutrients inland aren't making those trips. They're too weak, too focused on basic survival. Ursa makes the decision that bear mothers have had to make for millions of years when food becomes too scarce. She abandons her cubs. It's a brutal calculation written into bear biology. Better for one adult to survive and potentially reproduce again than for all 3 to starve. The cubs, still dependent on their mother's milk and protection, won't survive a week on their own. Across Alaska, hundreds of bear cubs die not from predation or disease, but from a collapse in food webs that started with missing bees. Meanwhile, in Costa Rica's cloud forests, something equally devastating unfolds. The 3-wattled bellbird, famous for having one of the loudest calls in the animal kingdom, times its breeding season to the fruiting of bee-pollinated trees. The birds need the high-energy fruits to feed their chicks during the demanding nesting period, but the trees flowered and dropped their blossoms without setting fruit. Parent bellbirds, desperate to feed their young, exhaust themselves searching for food that doesn't exist. Nests that should be full of fledgling birds instead hold only the remains of chicks that starved within sight of trees that should have been laden with fruit. The bellbird's calls, which can be heard for miles through the mountain forests, grow fewer each day. Soon, the cloud forests fall silent. But let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because what's happening to individual species is just a preview of something much larger. Ecosystems aren't just collections of plants and animals. They're incredibly complex networks of relationships. Energy flows through these networks in predictable patterns. Nutrients cycle through them in ancient rhythms. When you remove a keystone element like bees, the entire network begins to collapse in waves. Think of it like a city losing its transportation system. At first, the effects are localized. People can't get to work, goods can't be delivered. But pretty soon, the secondary effects kick in. Hospitals can't get supplies. Power plants can't get fuel. Waste removal stops. Food distribution breaks down. What started as a transportation problem becomes a complete urban collapse. That's what's happening to ecosystems across the planet. In tropical rainforests, the collapse is particularly dramatic because the diversity is so high and the relationships are so specialized. The rainforest canopy is like a three-dimensional city, with different species living at different levels, from the dark forest floor to the sunny emergent layer 200 feet above. Many of the trees that form the canopy structure depend on specific bee species for pollination. When these trees can't reproduce, gaps in the canopy don't close. Normally, when a giant tree falls, dozens of smaller trees race to fill the gap, creating a dynamic mosaic of forest age and structure. But now, the trees that would normally fill these gaps can't reproduce. Pioneer species, the plants that usually colonize clearings, need bee pollination too. The forest loses its ability to heal itself. Within 5 years, rainforests that have maintained their structure for millions of years begin to look like Swiss cheese, random gaps that never fill, creating corridors for wind and erosion that damage the remaining forest. The layered architecture that supports thousands of species starts to collapse. The soil changes too. In healthy rainforests, nutrients cycle rapidly through the ecosystem. Dead leaves decompose quickly in the humid heat, feeding the thin topsoil that supports the towering trees. But many of the plants that drive this nutrient cycling, nitrogen-fixing legumes, deep-rooted herbs, decomposer-feeding fungi, depollinated plants. As these species disappear, the nutrient cycling slows down. Dead organic matter accumulates instead of decomposing. The soil becomes less fertile, just as the forest needs more resources to cope with the stress of missing species. It's like watching a city slowly lose its infrastructure, first the transportation, then the power grid, then the water system, then the waste management. Each failure makes the next one more likely and more severe. But some of the most devastating effects are the ones we can't see yet, the long-term consequences that won't show up for years or decades. Consider genetic diversity. Sexual reproduction, facilitated by pollinators like bees, shuffles genes between individuals, creating offspring that are genetically unique. This genetic mixing is what allows populations to adapt to new diseases, climate changes, and other environmental challenges. Without bees, plants that can still reproduce do so through cloning, sending out runners, dropping bulbs, fragmenting into identical copies. These clonal populations might survive for a while, but their evolutionary dead ends. They can't adapt to changing conditions because they don't have genetic variation to work with. It's like having a library where all the books are identical copies of one title. The library might look full, but it has no diversity, no resilience, no ability to provide what people need when conditions change. Climate change makes this even worse. As temperatures rise and weather patterns shift, plants need genetic diversity to adapt. Populations that can't sexually reproduce become sitting ducks for the first new disease or environmental stress that comes along. We're creating a world of plant populations that look healthy, but are actually genetic zombies, alive, but unable to evolve, maintain, or repair themselves. The nitrogen cycle, AB air, one of the fundamental processes that makes life on Earth possible, also begins to break down. Many of the plants that pull nitrogen from the atmosphere and convert it into forms other plants can use are legumes that require bee pollination: clover, vetch, lupine, countless others. As these nitrogen-fixing plants disappear, soil fertility crashes across the planet. Even crops that don't need bee pollination, like wheat, corn, and rice, begin to struggle in depleted soils. Farmers resort to massive amounts of synthetic fertilizers, but producing those fertilizers requires enormous amounts of energy and creates pollution that further stresses the remaining ecosystems. It's a downward spiral. Less nitrogen fixation means more synthetic fertilizers. More synthetic fertilizers mean more pollution. More pollution means more stress on the surviving plants and animals. More stress means more extinctions. More extinctions mean even less nitrogen fixation. But perhaps the most chilling effect is what happens to evolution itself. For 100 million years, flowering plants and their pollinators have driven each other's evolution in an endless dance of adaptation and counter-adaptation. Flowers evolved new colors, shapes, and scents to attract pollinators. Pollinators evolved new behaviors, body shapes, and sensory abilities to exploit flowers. This co-evolutionary arms race created much of the biological diversity we see today. With the pollinators gone, that evolutionary engine shuts down. The flowers that remain are frozen in time, unable to evolve new strategies because there's no selective pressure from pollinators. It's like stopping a movie halfway through. The characters are stuck forever in whatever pose they were in when the film stopped rolling. And here's the really terrifying part. Once you lose a co-evolutionary relationship that took millions of years to develop, you can't just restart it. Even if we somehow brought bees back tomorrow, the plants that have been lost are gone forever. The intricate relationships between specific flowers and specific pollinators, refined over eons, would have to evolve all over again. Evolution doesn't have a rewind button. 6 months after the bees disappeared, scientists start documenting what they call ecological unraveling, the process by which complex ecosystems simplify into something that looks more like a vacant lot than a natural community. Prairie ecosystems that once supported 200 plant species are down to 30, all wind-pollinated grasses and weeds. Coastal sage scrub in California, once a tapestry of aromatic shrubs and colorful wildflowers, becomes monotonous expanses of sagebrush. Even suburban gardens transform into something alien, lawns and a few hardy shrubs, but no flowers, no color, no diversity. The world doesn't become empty. That would almost be easier to understand. Instead, it becomes monotonous, simplified, grey, like someone took a painting full of colours and reduced it to pencil sketches. Children born after the collapse won't know what they're missing. To them, this simplified world will seem normal. Brown springs, flowerless summers, fruit-free autumns. That's just how seasons work in their experience. When they see pre-collapse photos of wildflower meadows and diverse gardens, they'll think they're looking at fantasy art. But the adults who remember the before times, they're living in a constant state of grief. Psychologists start documenting a new condition they call ecological depression, a persistent sadness that comes from watching the world become a shadow of what it used to be. And we haven't even talked about what this means for human civilization yet. Because while ecosystems collapse and food webs unravel, 7 billion people still need to eat. The question becomes, how do you feed humanity when the biological systems that evolved to do that job have suddenly stopped working? That's where desperation meets innovation, where human ingenuity faces its greatest test, where we find out if technology can replace evolution and whether machines can do the work of insects. Spoiler alert, it's not going well. In a sterile white laboratory at Harvard University, Professor Sarah Chen stares at what might be humanity's last hope. It's about the size of a quarter, weighs less than a paperclip, and represents 3 years of round-the-clock engineering by some of the smartest people on the planet. Meet RoboBee, the mechanical pollinator that was supposed to save the world. The tiny robot hovers in the test chamber, its transparent wings beating 120 times per second, creating a high-pitched whine that sounds nothing like the gentle hum of real bees. Solar panels smaller than sequins power its miniature motors. Cameras the size of pinheads guide its flight. It's a marvel of engineering, a triumph of miniaturization, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of impossible odds. It's also completely useless. RoboBee can hover for exactly 4 minutes before its battery dies. In those 4 minutes, flying at maximum efficiency, it can visit maybe 40 flowers. A real bee, the kind that disappeared 6 months ago, could visit that many flowers in 9-10 minutes and keep going all day long. But here's the real problem, the math. Professor Chen pulls up the calculations that have been keeping her awake for weeks. 1 acre of apple trees needs approximately 3 billion flower visits during the brief pollination window each spring. 3 billion. At 40 flowers per 4-minute flight, each RoboBee handles about 480 flowers per day, assuming perfect efficiency and no downtime for maintenance. You'd need 6.25 million robots to pollinate a single acre of apple trees. The United States has 750,000 acres of apple orchards. That's 4.7 trillion robots. The global manufacturing capacity for microprocessors, every computer chip, smartphone, and electronic device combined, would need to run for 17 years just to build enough robots to replace the bees in American apple orchards alone. And that's just apples. We haven't even started on almonds, which need 60 billion flower visits per year just in California. Professor Chen does the math one more time, hoping she made an error. She didn't. The global cost to replace bees with robots, $17 trillion annually. That's more than the combined GDP of China and the United States. Every year, forever. But the economics are just the beginning of the problems. RoboBee crashes into the wall of the test chamber and falls to the floor like a broken toy. These robots, marvels of engineering though they are, break constantly. The wings crack, the motors burn out, the cameras get dirty. Real bees fix themselves. Well, they don't break in the first place because evolution spent 50 million years debugging their design. And then there's the intelligence problem. A real bee doesn't just fly from flower to flower randomly. She's running incredibly sophisticated algorithms in a brain the size of a sesame seed. She remembers which flowers have the best nectar, what time of day they produce the most, how to navigate back to the hive from miles away. She communicates the location of good flower patches to her sisters through waggle dances that encode distance and direction with mathematical precision. RoboBee follows pre-programmed routes. It can't adapt to changing conditions, can't learn from experience, can't communicate with other robots. It's like trying to replace a skilled craftsman with a very simple machine. Technically possible for basic tasks, but missing 90% of what made the original so effective. Still, the research continues because what else are they going to do? Let humanity starve? Down the hall from Professor Chen's lab, another team works on a different approach: genetic modification. If they can't replace the bees, maybe they can engineer plants that don't need them. Dr. Michael Rodriguez has been working for 18 months to create self-pollinating almonds. The concept is simple. Modify the flowers so they can fertilize themselves without needing insects to transfer pollen between plants. The first trials were promising. The modified almond trees produced nuts, But when those nuts were harvested and tested, something was wrong. They were smaller than normal almonds, bitter, wrinkled, barely edible. The problem, Dr. Rodriguez discovered, is that evolution developed sexual reproduction for good reasons. When plants reproduce sexually, with pollen from one individual fertilizing flowers on another, the offspring get genetic material from both parents. This genetic mixing creates diversity, vigor, resistance to disease. Self-pollinating plants are essentially cloning themselves. The nuts they produce are genetically identical to the parent plant, lacking the hybrid vigor that comes from genetic diversity. They're weaker, more susceptible to disease, less nutritious. Dr. Rodriguez tries again with strawberries. The results are even worse. Misshapen fruits that look like they were designed by someone who had never seen a strawberry. They taste like cardboard and spoil within hours of being picked. It's like trying to breed racehorses using only identical twins. Dr. Rodriguez explains to his increasingly frustrated funding committee, "You might get horses, but you won't get champions." But the researchers keep trying because giving up means accepting that humanity will survive on a diet of wind-pollinated grains and root vegetables forever. The variety that made human cuisine one of the great achievements of our species, IT-FIs, gone. The nutritional diversity that kept us healthy, reduced to supplements and synthetic vitamins. Meanwhile, in China's Sichuan province, they're not waiting for technological miracles. They're scaling up the human pollination system they've been perfecting since the 1980s. Liu Wei manages a crew of 300 workers whose job is to replace what evolution designed bees to do. Every morning before dawn, they mix pollen collected and frozen from the previous year with cornstarch and other extenders to make the precious substance go further. The pollen comes from the few remaining hand-pollinated trees, stored in industrial freezers like a strategic reserve. The workers climb aluminum ladders through the orchard, each carrying a small jar of pollen mixture and a brush made from chopsticks and cigarette filters. The technique requires incredible precision. Too little pollen, and the flower won't set fruit. Too much, and you waste the increasingly scarce resource. Each worker can pollinate about 30 trees per day, working from sunrise to sunset. A single bee colony, naught back when they existed, would have covered 3,000 trees in the same time. The labor costs are staggering. Where bee pollination was essentially free, human pollination costs about $12 per tree. With 40 trees per acre, that's $480 per acre just for pollination, not counting all the other costs of growing fruit. The pears that result from this labor-intensive process cost 5 times what bee-pollinated pears used to cost. Even in China, they've become luxury items. On the global market, Chinese pears now sell for $60 per pound, when you can find them at all. But Liu Wei's operation is one of the success stories. At least they're producing fruit. Most of the world isn't even trying. In Australia, researchers take a different approach. Instead of replacing bees with robots or humans, they're trying to engineer new bees from scratch. Dr. Emily Watson's lab looks like something from a science fiction movie. Tanks full of nutrients support developing insect larvae. Microscopic manipulators inject genetic material into eggs, smaller than periods at the end of sentences. Computer screens display the genetic code of extinct bee species, digitized from DNA samples preserved in museum specimens. The goal is ambitious: resurrect bee species from genetic information, like Jurassic Park, but with insects instead of dinosaurs. Take the DNA of extinct bees, insert it into closely related species that are still alive, and essentially bring back the dead. The early experiments are promising. Dr. Watson's team successfully creates bee larvae that carry genetic material from extinct species. Under the microscope, they look exactly like baby bees should look. But then they die. Every single one. The problem, Dr. Watson learns, is that bees aren't just their DNA. They're also the millions of microorganisms that live in their guts, helping them digest pollen and nectar. They're the learned behaviors passed down from mother to daughter over thousands of generations. They're the complex social structures that allow 50,000 individuals to function as a single superorganism. You can't resurrect a bee any more than you can resurrect a human by just copying their DNA. Too much of what makes them functional is stored not in genes but in relationships, behaviors, and microbial partnerships that we barely understand. After 2 years and $50 million, Dr. Watson's lab has produced exactly 0 living bees. But the most heartbreaking failures happen in the developing world, where people can't afford high-tech solutions and have to make do with whatever they can improvise. In Kenya, where coffee provides income for 6 million people, farmers try to pollinate their crops by hand using paintbrushes bought at art supply stores. Coffee flowers are tiny, delicate, and need to be pollinated within hours of opening. The work is impossibly tedious. Mary Wanjiku, who has grown coffee on her 2-acre farm for 30 years, spends 12 hours a day during blooming season crouched over coffee bushes with a paintbrush the size of a pencil eraser. Her back aches constantly. Her eyes strain to see the tiny flowers in the pre-dawn darkness when they're most receptive to pollination. At the end of a good day, Mary might successfully pollinate 500 flowers. Her farm has 20,000 coffee plants, each producing hundreds of flowers during the brief blooming season. The math is impossible. She can't physically pollinate even 1% of her crop. Her coffee harvest, which used to provide enough income to send her children to school and maintain her home, drops to almost nothing. The beans that do develop are small and bitter, because hand pollination is so hit or miss compared to the precision of bee pollination. Mary's story repeats across the developing world. In Ghana and Ivory Coast, which produce 60% of the world's cocoa, farmers watch their economic foundation crumble. Cocoa flowers need pollination by tiny midges that disappeared along with the bees. No amount of human effort can replace insects that are smaller than rice grains. Vietnam's cashew industry, which employs millions and provides crucial foreign currency, simply ceases to exist. Cashew flowers require specialized pollination that no human technique can replicate. These aren't just economic disasters, they're humanitarian catastrophes. Entire societies built around bee-dependent crops face collapse. Kids who should be in school spend their days helping parents with futile hand pollination efforts. Families that have farmed the same land for generations abandon their homes to look for work in cities that are already overwhelmed with climate refugees and economic migrants. Meanwhile, in underground facilities from Norway to Colombia, seed banks work frantically to preserve what's left. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault, built into a mountainside in the Arctic, was designed to preserve crop diversity for future generations. Now it's become something more urgent, a genetic museum of foods that will never grow again. Dr. Sarah Kim, the Vault's director, walks through corridors lined with millions of seed samples stored at -18 degrees Celsius. Each package is labeled with crops that sound like poetry from a lost world. Cherokee purple tomatoes requires buzz pollination by bumblebees. Madagascar vanilla, hand pollination only, yields drop 90% without specific bee species. Passion fruit, dependent on carpenter bee pollination. The irony isn't lost on Dr. Kim. They have the genetic blueprints for thousands of crop varieties, but without the pollinators, the seeds are just museum pieces. It's like having sheet music for symphonies when all the orchestras have disbanded. Some seeds can still be grown in climate-controlled greenhouses with human pollination, but the costs are astronomical. A single greenhouse tomato, pollinated by hand with a tiny brush, costs $30 to produce. A head of greenhouse-grown broccoli costs $60. These aren't market prices. These are the actual costs of growing food when you have to replace evolution with human labor. But perhaps the most sobering reality check comes from the economic modelling teams trying to figure out what a post-B the world would actually cost. Professor Janet Liu at MIT runs the numbers on what economists call ecosystem service replacement. Before the collapse, bees provided pollination services worth $217 billion globally every year. That was essentially free nectar. The bees worked for nectar and pollen, costs that were built into the plants themselves. Now, to replace that $217 billion worth of work with human labor, robots, or genetic modification, the actual cost comes to about $3.4 trillion annually. And that's assuming we could actually scale up the solutions to global levels, which we can't. Professor Liu's models show that food prices would need to increase by 800 to 1200% to cover the real costs of production. An apple that used to cost 50 cents would cost between $4 and $6. A cup of coffee would cost $40. A chocolate bar would cost $80. But even those prices assume we could actually produce the food, which in most cases we can't. The labor requirements alone are impossible. Hand-pollinating all of America's bee-dependent crops would require the full-time work of 90 million people. That's more than half the current workforce doing nothing but pollination. The technology solutions aren't any better. Manufacturing enough robots to replace bees would require building new factories bigger than entire cities. The rare earth metals needed for the electronics don't exist in sufficient quantities. The energy requirements would double global electricity consumption. As the first year without bees draws to a close, the consensus among researchers becomes clear. We can't replace them. Not with current technology, not with unlimited funding, not with the entire human workforce dedicated to the problem. The best we can do is maintain small-scale production of the most critical crops in controlled environments at costs that make them luxury. Items available only to the wealthy. The varied, abundant, affordable food system that fed humanity for generations is gone. But even that grim assessment assumes we can maintain the controlled environments, the genetic preservation facilities, the research labs. Because while scientists work desperately to develop solutions, the broader civilization that supports their work is starting to crack under the pressure of feeding 7 billion people with a suddenly impoverished food system. The economic shockwaves are spreading beyond agriculture. When coffee costs $40 a cup, coffee shops close. When chocolate costs $80 a bar, candy companies shut down. When fresh fruit becomes a luxury item, the entire food processing industry has to reinvent itself around whatever ingredients are still available. Supply chains optimized for variety and abundance can't adapt to scarcity and monotony. The global food system, fine-tuned over decades to deliver thousands of different products to every corner of the world, breaks down when 90% of those products simply stop existing. And that's when things start getting really scary, because hungry people don't just accept hunger, they fight for whatever food remains. The question isn't whether we can replace bees with technology. The question is, what happens to human civilization when we can't? When the abundance that made modern life possible disappears overnight, and 7 billion people wake up in a world where food is scarce, expensive, and monotonous. That's where our story goes next, into the geopolitics of starvation, the economics of scarcity, and the social upheaval that happens when the foundation of civilization cracks apart. Because the technology failed, the robots broke, the genetic engineering didn't work, the human labor was impossibly expensive and insufficient. Now it's time to see what happens when hope turns to hunger, and hunger turns to war. Year 2, without bees. In the international terminal of what used to be one of the world's busiest airports, Marcus Chen waits in a line that stretches for 3 hours. He's not waiting for a flight. Commercial aviation collapsed 6 months ago when jet fuel prices tripled due to economic chaos. He's waiting for coffee. The line moves at the pace of a funeral procession because each cup costs $200 and requires government-issued food stamps plus cash. The coffee itself comes from one of the last functioning plantations in Colombia, where workers hand-pollinate coffee flowers with paintbrushes in a desperate attempt to maintain some production. Marcus has been saving for 3 months to afford this cup. Not because he's particularly wealthy, he's a software engineer, solidly middle class in the before times. But because coffee, like chocolate, like most fruits, like anything that used to require bee pollination, has become a luxury that only the very rich can afford regularly. He reaches the front of the line and hands over his cash and stamps. The barista, who used to work at a Starbucks before the chain went bankrupt, carefully measures out a single shot of espresso. No milk, because dairy cows can't survive on the available feed without bee-pollinated alfalfa and soybeans. No sugar, because sugar comes from sugar beets, and sugar beets need bee pollination. Marcus takes his first sip in 3 months and closes his eyes. It tastes like memory, like the world that existed before. But coffee is just the beginning of what's disappeared from daily life. Walk through any supermarket now, and you'll see the new reality of human nutrition. Entire aisles that used to burst with variety now contain nothing but different preparations of the same basic ingredients. Potato chips, potato flakes, potato flour, potato starch, corn tortillas, corn meal, corn syrup, corn oil, rice cakes, rice noodles, rice flour, rice crackers. The produce section, once a rainbow of colors and textures, now looks like a study in brown and green. Potatoes, onions, carrots, cabbage, lettuce, spinach. The same 7 vegetables in endless rotation. No apples, no berries, no melons, no stone fruits, no tomatoes, no peppers, no squash, no eggplant. Children who are too young to remember the before times think this is normal. They don't know that food used to come in dozens of colors. They don't understand why adults sometimes stare sadly at old cookbook photos showing dishes made with ingredients that no longer exist. But the psychological impact on adults is devastating. Psychologists document a new condition they call dietary grief disorder, a persistent depression that comes from the loss of food variety and pleasure. Humans evolved to crave diversity in our diets, both for nutritional and psychological reasons. When that diversity disappears, something fundamental breaks in our relationship with food. Restaurants, once temples to culinary creativity, become exercises in creative limitation. The most acclaimed chef in New York has built her reputation on what she can do with 15 ingredients. Her signature dish, Symphony and Potato, uses potatoes prepared 7 different ways to create the illusion of variety. But the real catastrophe isn't happening in wealthy countries where people can at least afford the monotonous basics. It's happening in nations that built their entire economies around bee-dependent crops. In Bangladesh, where bitter gourd and pumpkin used to comprise 30% of the vegetable intake, malnutrition rates skyrocket. Without these vitamin-rich foods, 50,000 children go blind from vitamin A deficiency in the first year alone. The government tries to compensate with synthetic vitamin supplements, but they cost more than the entire gross domestic product. In Brazil, the acai industry, which employed millions and provided superfood exports worth billions, simply ceases to exist. Acai palms still grow wild in the Amazon, but without their native bee pollinators, the berries don't develop. Communities that have harvested acai for generations face starvation in forests that look abundant but produce nothing edible. The geopolitics shift with terrifying speed. Countries that historically depended on food imports find themselves cut off from global markets, not because of trade wars or political tensions, but because there simply isn't enough food to trade. Nations with wind-pollinated crops, wheat, corn, rice, pear, become the new superpowers overnight. Russia, with its vast wheat fields, goes from economic pariah to global kingmaker. Canada's prairie provinces, once considered agricultural backwaters, now control resources more valuable than oil. Countries that were major food exporters just 2 years ago become desperate importers, bidding against each other for basic calories. The United States finds itself in a bizarre position. Despite having some of the most advanced agricultural technology in the world, American food production plummets because so much of it depends on bee-pollinated crops. California's Central Valley, once called America's salad bowl, produces nothing but wheat and corn. The state that used to feed much of the country becomes a net food importer. Meanwhile, Argentina's beef industry experiences an unexpected boom. Cattle eat grass, and grass doesn't need bee pollination. Suddenly, Argentine beef costs less than California almonds used to cost. The global protein market flips upside down. But the most dramatic changes happen in the developing world, where entire societies built around bee-dependent cash crops face complete collapse. In Kenya, the coffee industry that employed 6 million people simply evaporates. Coffee requires precise pollination of tiny, delicate flowers that open for just a few hours. No amount of human labor can replace the work that specialized bees used to do for free. 6 million people suddenly have no income. Many are small farmers who used coffee earnings to buy food, pay school fees, and maintain their homes. Without coffee revenue, families that have lived on the same land for generations abandon their farms and head to cities already overwhelmed with economic refugees. Nairobi's population doubles in 18 months as rural families flee the countryside. Slums expand at the city's edges like mushrooms after rain. The government, already struggling with reduced tax revenue from the collapsed coffee industry, can't provide services for the flood of internal migrants. Similar scenes play out across the developing world. In Ghana and Ivory Coast, which together produce 60% of the world's cocoa, the collapse is even more dramatic. Cocoa flowers are pollinated by tiny midges that are too small for human replacement. When the midges disappeared with the bees, cocoa production simply stopped. 40 million people in West Africa lose their primary source of income overnight. The economic refugees don't just migrate within their own countries, they attempt dangerous journeys to Europe and North America, fleeing agricultural collapse like people once fled war zones. The European Union, already struggling with its own food shortages, faces waves of climate and agricultural refugees that dwarf previous migration crises. Borders that were open become heavily fortified. Countries that prided themselves on humanitarian values build walls to keep out people fleeing ecological collapse. Vietnam's economy, heavily dependent on cashew exports, faces similar devastation. Cashew flowers require specialized pollination that no human technique can replicate. The industry that employed millions and provided crucial foreign currency disappears literally overnight. But perhaps the most heartbreaking transformation happens in areas that were known for their agricultural diversity and food culture. The Mediterranean region, famous for its varied cuisine and abundant produce, becomes a monotonous landscape of olive trees and wheat fields. No tomatoes for Italian cuisine, no peppers for Spanish dishes, no eggplant for Greek recipes. Traditional food cultures that developed over millennia disappear within a single generation. French cuisine, once considered the pinnacle of culinary art, adapts to a reality where most traditional ingredients simply don't exist. Restaurants in Paris serve historical menus, featuring pictures of dishes made with extinct ingredients, like museums displaying artifacts from a lost civilization. Wine regions around the world face a peculiar problem. Grapes are wind-pollinated and don't need bees, so vineyards continue producing wine. But the food that traditionally accompanies wine, AI, cheeses made from the milk of cows fed on bee-pollinated crops, fruits, nuts, complex dishes, has largely disappeared. Wine culture survives, but the culinary culture around it is gone. The black markets that emerge around scarce foods create new forms of crime and violence. A single vanilla pod, NK, vanilla requires hand pollination even with bees, making it impossibly rare now. sells for $5,000 on the black market. Freeze-dried strawberries become currency in some regions. Armed gangs hijack trucks carrying shipments of apples or oranges from the few remaining greenhouse operations. Governments struggle to maintain order as food prices spiral beyond what most people can afford. In countries where food represents 60 or 70% of household spending, even in good times, the price increases create immediate social upheaval. Riots break out in cities around the world. Not political riots, not ideological conflicts, but hunger riots. People who have never broken a law in their lives find themselves stealing food to feed their families. Police forces, whose members are also struggling to afford food, often refuse to intervene. The concept of food security, once an abstract policy concern, becomes the defining political issue of the era. Elections are won and lost based on candidates' promises to somehow restore food abundance. Political parties form around single issues: how to feed people when the biological systems that evolved to do that job have broken down. International conflicts begin not over territory or resources in the traditional sense, but over access to the few remaining productive agricultural areas. The last coffee plantation in Colombia becomes a strategic asset worth fighting for. Greenhouse complexes that can still produce fruits and vegetables are guarded like military installations. Countries with the technological capacity to maintain controlled environment agriculture become targets for economic espionage and cyber attacks. The genetic sequences of extinct bee species, stored in research databases, become state secrets as valuable as nuclear codes. But perhaps the most fundamental change is in how humans relate to food itself. In the developed world, food had become entertainment, identity, and culture. People traveled the world to try different cuisines. Cooking shows dominated television. Social media overflowed with photos of elaborate meals. All of that disappears almost overnight. Food becomes what it was for most of human history: fuel for survival. The pleasure, variety, and cultural richness that characterized human cuisine for the past century reduces to a simple question: did you get enough calories today? Restaurants that remain open serve variations on the same basic theme. Protein, starch, and whatever vegetables can still be grown. The elaborate fusion cuisines, the molecular gastronomy, the artisanal everything, gone. Food culture flattens into subsistence, but even subsistence becomes difficult as production continues to decline. The first year without bees saw dramatic drops in fruit and vegetable production. The second year sees secondary effects as livestock industries collapse due to lack of feed crops. The third year brings tertiary effects as soil fertility declines without nitrogen-fixing plants. It's a cascade of hunger that accelerates rather than stabilizes. Each year is worse than the last because the biological systems that support agriculture are breaking down faster than human systems can adapt. By the end of year 2, it becomes clear that this isn't a temporary crisis that technology or human ingenuity can solve. This is a permanent shift to a different kind of world, one where food is scarce, expensive, and monotonous, where the abundance that made modern civilization possible is just a memory. And that realization changes everything about how humans see their future. Because if we can't feed ourselves the way we used to, if we can't maintain the variety and abundance that characterized human progress for centuries, then what kind of civilization can we maintain? That question leads us to the final chapter of our story, not just what the world looks like without bees, but what human society becomes when it has to adapt to permanent scarcity instead of continuing abundance. It's a future that's already beginning, in small ways, in corners of the world where the old systems have already broken down, and it's coming faster than anyone expected. 20 years after the silence, 8-year-old Maya has never seen a flower. Not a living one, anyway. She's seen pictures in the old books at the library, and sometimes her grandmother shows her photographs from the before times, but Maya thinks they're fantasy art, like the pictures of dragons and unicorns in fairy tale books. "Grandma, why did people paint flowers if they weren't real?" Maya asks, flipping through a coffee table book from 2024 that shows gardens in full bloom. Her grandmother, Elena, pauses in her work. She's preparing dinner, potato soup with carrots and onions, the same meal they've had 3 times this week. "They were real, sweetheart. There used to be flowers everywhere. Different colors, different shapes, different smells." Maya studies the photographs more carefully. But how did they make the colors so bright? And why are there so many different kinds? Elena tries to explain. But how do you describe color to someone who has only known brown? How do you explain abundance to someone who has only known scarcity? Maya's world consists of grasses, root vegetables, and the monotonous green of wind-pollinated trees. The idea of petals seems as fantastical as wings on humans. Outside their apartment window, the world looks exactly like Maya expects the world to look. It's late spring, but spring no longer means what it used to mean. The trees are leafing out in various shades of green: oaks, maples, pines, and other wind-pollinated species that survived the collapse. But there are no cherry blossoms, no dogwood flowers, no tulips or daffodils announcing the season's change. Spring arrives brown and stays brown until summer arrives brown. Autumn used to paint the landscape in reds and golds from berry bushes and flowering trees. Now autumn is just the time when grass dies back and leaves fall from the surviving trees. Seasons have become transitions between different shades of beige. Maya's school teaches something called heritage biology, the study of life forms that used to exist. She learns about bee pollination, the way students once learned about dinosaurs, as an interesting fact about the ancient world. The textbooks show pictures of flowers and fruits with the same detached scientific interest once reserved for pterodactyls and trilobites. Pollination was a mutualistic relationship between flowering plants and insects. Maya reads aloud from her homework. The insects received nectar and pollen for food, while the plants received reproductive services. This system functioned for approximately 100 million years before ceasing in the 2020s. It sounds like ancient history. Maya has no more emotional connection to the loss of bees than she does to the extinction of woolly mammoths. It happened before she was born, in a world so different from hers that it might as well have been a different planet. But for Elena, every brown spring is a fresh wound. She remembers when the world exploded into color every April. She remembers farmers' markets overflowing with 40 varieties of apples, 12 types of berries, melons, and stone fruits and vegetables, in colors that don't exist anymore. She remembers the smell of flowers, roses, jasmine, lilacs perfuming the air in ways that made you stop walking just to breathe. Now the air smells like grass and dirt and exhaust from the few vehicles still operating. Pleasant enough, but monotonous. Elena suffers from what psychologists now recognize as a distinct condition: ecological grief disorder. Unlike normal grief, which eventually fades, ecological grief gets worse over time as the contrast between memory and reality deepens. Every spring without flowers, every summer without fruit, every autumn without berry colors, reinforces the magnitude of what was lost. Support groups meet in community centers to help the older generation process their loss. They share photos from the before times, like people sharing pictures of deceased relatives. They tell stories about tastes and smells and colors that their children and grandchildren will never experience. "I remember strawberries," someone might say. Not just the taste, but the smell when you opened a basket of them. Sweet and green and alive. The younger people in these groups, people in their 30s and 40s who remember the transition, nod sadly. But their children, the Maya generation, listen politely to stories about imaginary foods the way they might listen to fairy tales. The physical infrastructure of the old world slowly crumbles from disuse. Orchards, where fruit trees still grow but never bear fruit, are gradually converted to other uses. The Trees themselves live for decades, blooming hopefully each spring in displays that are beautiful but futile. Eventually, property owners cut them down and plant something useful, more vegetables maybe, or just grass. Urban gardens that once showcased hundreds of flower varieties become practical spaces, focused on the 7 vegetables that still grow reliably: potatoes, carrots, onions, cabbage, lettuce, spinach, and radishes. City planning departments remove flower beds from public spaces and replace them with vegetable plots, or simply leave them as grassy areas that require less maintenance. The color vocabulary itself changes. Children learn words like violet, fuchsia, and coral as historical terms, like telegram or phonograph. These colors still exist in manufactured items: paint, clothing, plastic toys, but they're no longer connected to living things. The natural world has become a study in earth tones. Museums create color gardens, indoor spaces with artificial lighting, where they maintain the last flowering plants like living exhibits. Children take school field trips to see what flowers looked like, the way they once visited dinosaur skeletons. Guards watch over these facilities more carefully than banks because the genetic material they preserve is literally irreplaceable. Maya goes on one of these field trips when she's 10. The museum's climate-controlled greenhouse maintains about 50 species of flowering plants, hand-pollinated by staff members wearing magnifying glasses and wielding brushes smaller than pencil erasers. Maya sees her first real flower, a red tulip blooming under artificial lights. The color is so intense, so saturated compared to anything in her normal world, that she starts crying, not from sadness, but from sensory overload. Her brain, adapted to a brown and green world, can't process the intensity. "It's too bright," she tells her teacher. "It hurts to look at." The museum guide explains that human eyes evolved in a world full of bright colors, from flowers, fruits, and colorful animals. "Your eyes are designed to see this," she tells Maya, "but because you've never experienced it before, it seems overwhelming." Maya spends the rest of the field trip wearing sunglasses, even indoors. The flowers that once brought joy to humans now seem alien, almost aggressive in their brightness. Evolution designed humans to be attracted to colorful flowers and fruits, but when an entire generation grows up without them, that attraction becomes disorienting. The food system that emerges from this new reality represents a complete revolution in human nutrition and cuisine. Chefs become alchemists, transforming the same 15 basic ingredients into hundreds of variations through techniques that would have seemed absurd in the before times. The most celebrated chef in the world, a woman named Sarah Kim, who grew up during the transition, has built her reputation on monotone cuisine, creating the illusion of variety, using only ingredients that can still be grown. Her signature dish involves potatoes prepared 12 different ways to simulate the texture and flavor experience of a traditional 7-course meal. She ferments potatoes to create tangy flavors reminiscent of fruit. She dehydrates them and grinds them into powders that mimic spices that no longer exist. She cultures them with bacteria to develop umami tastes that substitute for extinct mushroom varieties. "The human palate craves complexity," Chef Kim explains to her culinary students. "Even when complexity doesn't exist in nature anymore, we have to create it artificially. Cooking is now an act of imagination, not just technique." Her restaurant, which serves a single tasting menu based on seasonal variations of root vegetables and grains, has a waiting list of 2 years. Food has become so monotonous that even the illusion of variety commands premium prices. Mushroom cultivation becomes one of the few growth industries because fungi don't need pollinators. Underground farms in abandoned subway tunnels grow dozens of mushroom varieties that provide some of the only flavor diversity left in human diets. Mushroom farmers become the new vintners, cultivating exotic varieties with names like ghost oyster and wine cap that sell for hundreds of dollars per pound. Algae farms spring up in coastal areas, growing single-celled organisms in massive tanks. Algae provides nutrients that humans can no longer get from fruits and vegetables, but it tastes like seaweed and has the texture of slime. Food scientists work constantly to mask the flavor and create the illusion that people are eating something other than pond scum. Synthetic biology emerges as a desperate attempt to recreate the flavors and nutrients of extinct foods. Labs use genetically modified bacteria to produce compounds that taste like strawberries, smell like roses, or provide the antioxidants once found in berries. These synthetic flavors and nutrients work, technically, but they lack the complexity and subtle variations of their natural counterparts. A synthetic strawberry flavor might trigger the same taste receptors as a real strawberry, but it's missing hundreds of trace compounds that created the full sensory experience. It's like looking at a black and white photograph of a rainbow, technically accurate but fundamentally incomplete. The pharmaceutical industry adapts to provide synthetic versions of the vitamins, antioxidants, and phytonutrients that people once got from diverse diets. Vitamin supplementation becomes mandatory in many countries to prevent deficiency diseases. Children take pills that provide nutrients their ancestors got from eating berries, fruits, and colorful vegetables. But pills can't replace everything. The gut microbiome, which co-evolved with human diet over millions of years, begins to change in response to the simplified food supply. Digestive disorders become epidemic. Mental health problems linked to gut bacteria dysfunction skyrocket. The human body, designed to thrive on dietary diversity, struggles to function on monotonous nutrition. Cancer rates increase as people lose access to the protective compounds found in colorful fruits and vegetables. Heart disease becomes more common without the cardiovascular benefits of diverse plant compounds. Autoimmune disorders multiply as immune systems, deprived of the training they get from diverse dietary inputs, to begin attacking the body itself. The children of Maya's generation don't just lack access to diverse foods, they're physiologically different from their grandparents. Their gut bacteria are simplified, their immune systems are undertrained, their sensory systems are adapted to a world without color or flavor variety. When these children occasionally encounter preserved foods from the before times, a can of peaches found in someone's emergency supplies, or a jar of jam from an old preservation facility, they often can't tolerate them. The intensity of flavor and sweetness overwhelms digestive systems adapted to bland, monotonous diets. Architecture and urban design adapt to the new reality. Buildings no longer include features designed around flowering plants, no garden terraces, no courtyards designed to showcase seasonal color changes, no large windows positioned to look out on flower gardens. New construction focuses on practical growing spaces for food production. The suburbs, once designed around ornamental landscapes, transform into agricultural communities. Front lawns become vegetable plots. Golf courses convert to potato farms. Public parks dedicate space to community gardens growing the 7 vegetables that still work reliably. But perhaps the most profound change is in human psychology and culture. Seasonal affective disorder, once limited to winter months, becomes a year-round condition as monotonous landscapes provide no chromatic variety to mark the passage of time. Birth rates plummet in regions that lost the most biodiversity, as studies show that humans struggle to maintain optimism and hope in environments lacking natural beauty and variety. Art and literature adapt to reflect the new reality. The nature poetry of the before times, full of references to flowers and fruits and colorful landscapes, becomes historical curiosity studied the way scholars once studied ancient Greek references to gods that nobody believed in anymore. New forms of art emerge that celebrate the subtle beauty of the surviving world, the different textures of bark, the varied shapes of leaves, the way grass moves in wind. It's a more austere aesthetic, focused on finding beauty in limitation rather than abundance. Music changes too. The metaphors and imagery that once filled songs, roses, gardens, fruit, the colors of nature disappear from contemporary lyrics. New musicians develop styles based on the sounds of the remaining world. Wind through grass, the rustle of leaves, the mechanical sounds of the greenhouse operations that produce the last fruits. Fashion evolves away from the bright colors that once mimicked flowers and fruits. Earth tones become not just popular but psychologically necessary. People who wear bright colors are often seen as insensitive or nostalgic for a world that their children never knew. But underneath all these adaptations, something fundamental has changed in the human relationship with the natural world. For millions of years, humans evolved in environments rich with color, variety, and abundance. Our psychology, our sensory systems, our emotional lives were shaped by landscapes full of flowers and fruits and diverse life. Maya's generation is the first in human history to grow up without that sensory richness. They're not necessarily unhappy. They don't miss something they never experienced. But they're different. Neurological studies show changes in brain development in children who grow up in monotonous environments. They process visual information differently. They respond differently to color and variation when they do encounter it. Anthropologists debate whether this represents human adaptation to a new environment or the beginning of a decline in human sensory and emotional capacity. Are we becoming a simpler species to match our simpler world? Or are we losing something essential to what made us human in the first place? These questions become more urgent as scientists realize that the changes aren't reversible. Even if we could somehow bring back bees tomorrow, the plants they co-evolved with are gone. The intricate relationships between specific flowers and specific pollinators, refined over millions of years, would take millions of years to evolve again. Evolution doesn't have an undo button. The world that Maya's grandmother remembers is gone forever, not just for now, but for all of human history going forward. We've crossed a threshold from which there's no return. But Maya doesn't know any of this as she helps her grandmother prepare their potato soup. To her, this is just the world. This is what normal looks like. The brown springs, the monotonous diet, the landscapes without flowers, this is reality. She's not sad about it because how can you mourn something you never experienced? She's not angry about it because anger requires a sense of loss, and she never had what was lost. Maya is the first generation of humans adapted to a world without bees. She's the preview of what humanity becomes when abundance turns to scarcity, when diversity becomes monotony, when the partnership that created the flowering world breaks down permanently. And that brings us to our final question. Could this actually happen? How much of this story is science fiction, and how much is a preview of the world we're already creating? Because while Maya and her grandmother are fictional characters, the biological relationships they've lost are real. The economic calculations are real. The ecological processes are real. We're living in the opening scenes of this story right now, and the choices we make in the next few years will determine whether Maya's world remains fiction or becomes our children's reality. That's where we need to go next, back to the present moment, to the crossroads where we still have time to choose a different ending. Here's the twist that should absolutely terrify you. We're already living in the beginning of the story I just told you. Right now, as I'm speaking to you, 40% of bee species are facing extinction, not in some imaginary future, not in a science fiction scenario, but today, this moment. While you're listening to this podcast, bee populations are collapsing across the planet at rates that scientists describe as unprecedented and catastrophic. Colony collapse disorder, first identified in 2006, causes entire hives to vanish overnight with symptoms identical to our fictional Day Zero. Beekeepers arrive at their apiaries to find perfect-looking bees lying dead in their hives, or more mysteriously, to find hives completely empty except for the queen, some larvae, and honey stores. The worker bees simply disappear. In the United States, commercial beekeepers routinely lose 30 to 50% of their colonies every winter. Some years, the losses reach 70%. Imagine if 30 to 50% of cattle died every year. Imagine if 30 to 50% of wheat crops failed annually. That's what's happening to bees, and we're treating it like a minor agricultural inconvenience. But here's what makes this even more terrifying than our fictional scenario. The causes are everywhere. They're accelerating, and they're synergistic. They work together to create a cascade of problems that's much worse than the sum of its parts. Let me walk you through the real villains in this unfolding disaster. First, neonicotinoid pesticides. These chemicals, introduced in the 1990s, seemed like a breakthrough in agricultural pest control. Unlike older pesticides that break down quickly, neonicotinoids are absorbed into plant tissues and remain there for months. When a plant is treated with neonicotinoids, every part of it becomes toxic to insects: the leaves, the stems, the pollen, the nectar. For crop pests, this is supposed to be a death sentence. But bees don't distinguish between crop pests and themselves when they're foraging for pollen and nectar. A bee visiting a neonicotinoid-treated flower gets a dose of nerve poison with every meal. Here's the insidious part. The doses are usually sublethal. They don't kill the bee immediately. Instead, they scramble the bee's nervous system. Bees exposed to sublethal neonicotinoid doses lose their ability to navigate. They fly in circles, unable to find their way back to the hive. They forget where good flower patches are located. Their waggle dance communication becomes garbled, giving their sisters incorrect directions to food sources. Imagine if every time you ate something, it made you slightly more likely to get lost driving home. That's what neonicotinoids do to bees. They turn foraging, the most essential behavior in a bee's life, into a death sentence delivered in slow motion. But pesticides are just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Varroa mites, accidentally imported from Asia in the 1980s, attach to bees like tiny vampires. They're about the size of a pinhead, but to a bee, they're proportionally like having a dinner plate attached to your back, sucking your blood. The mites don't just weaken bees directly, they spread viruses that cause wings to deform, immune systems to collapse, and entire colonies to die. The mites have spread to every continent except Antarctica. There are no bee populations left that haven't been exposed. And because bees evolved without these parasites, they have no natural defenses. It's like a new disease spreading through a population with no immunity. Climate change adds another layer of chaos. Bees and flowers co-evolved together over millions of years, timing their life cycles to match perfectly. Flowers bloom when their pollinators are most active. Bees emerge from winter dormancy when their food sources are available. But climate change is disrupting these timing relationships. Flowers bloom earlier due to warmer springs, but bees emerge on schedules set by daylight length, not temperature. The result is a mismatch. Hungry bees arriving to find that peak blooming has already passed, or flowers blooming when there are no pollinators available. Even worse, some flowering plants are shifting their ranges faster than their bee partners can follow. As temperatures warm, alpine flowers move up mountainsides and northern flowers move toward the poles. But specialist bees, with generations of location-specific behavior, can't adapt quickly enough to track their food sources. And then there's habitat loss, arguably the biggest threat of all. Where diverse prairies once bloomed from March through November, providing a continuous buffet of different flower types, we've planted mile after mile of single crops. A bee needs about 50 different types of flowers for complete nutrition, just like humans need diverse diets to stay healthy. But modern agriculture offers only one type of flower for miles in any direction. During almond bloom in California, 2 million acres produce only almond flowers for 2 weeks. They're nothing. For the rest of the year, those 2 million acres are a food desert for bees. It's like asking humans to survive on a diet where you get unlimited candy for 2 weeks, then nothing but white bread for the rest of the year. You might not starve, but you'll develop malnutrition, immune system problems, and eventually die from some secondary infection that a healthy individual could have fought off. The Dutch discovered this accidentally when they analyzed why bee populations in some areas were thriving while others collapsed. The healthy populations were near highways, with unmowed margins. Those strips of weeds between the road and agricultural fields provided 50 different flower types blooming in succession throughout the growing season. When they calculated the numbers, they found that leaving highway margins unmowed increased bee populations by 400% compared to areas where every inch was either crops or mowed grass. 400% increase just from letting weeds grow in a strip 50 feet wide. But here's what should give you hope. The solutions exist, they work, and they're often surprisingly simple. In Oslo, Norway, they created the world's first bee highway, En Oslos, a corridor of rooftop gardens, flower strips, and pollinator-friendly plantings that runs right through the city centre. It's not a metaphor. They literally created a highway for bees, with rest stops every 800 meters where pollinators can find food, shelter, and nesting sites. The project started small. A few apartment buildings planted bee-friendly flowers on their rooftops. Some businesses created pollinator gardens in their courtyards. The city added wildflower strips to public parks and along bike paths. Within 3 years, bee populations in Oslo increased by 200%, not just in parks and gardens, but throughout the urban area. It turns out that cities, with their diverse plantings and lack of pesticides, can be more bee-friendly than rural agricultural areas. Detroit, a city that knows something about rebuilding after collapse, has transformed thousands of abandoned lots into pollinator habitat. Where houses once stood, prairie grasses and wildflowers now bloom. Urban farms grow food alongside pollinator plants. The city that was once a symbol of industrial decline has become a model for ecological renewal. Costa Rica takes a different approach, paying farmers to maintain wildflower borders around their crops. The program costs the government about $50 per acre per year, but it increases crop yields by 30% because better pollination more than compensates for the small amount of land taken out of production. Cuba offers an unexpected success story. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, Cuba lost access to chemical fertilizers and pesticides overnight. By necessity, the country shifted to organic farming methods. Within a decade, Cuba had 50% higher bee populations than neighboring countries that continued using industrial agriculture. The lesson isn't that economic collapse is good for bees. It's that the industrial agricultural model isn't necessary for feeding people, and alternatives exist that are better for both humans and pollinators. But perhaps the most encouraging examples come from individual actions that seem small but add up to massive change. In the suburbs of Minneapolis, a retired teacher named Sarah Henderson decided to replace her front lawn with native wildflowers. Her neighbors thought she was crazy. The result looked messy compared to the manicured grass lawns that dominated the neighborhood. But within one season, Sarah's yard was buzzing with bees, butterflies, and other pollinators that had been nearly absent from the area. Her vegetable garden, which had struggled for years, suddenly exploded with productivity as pollination improved. More importantly, Sarah documented everything and shared her results with neighbors. Within 5 years, 40% of the lawns in her neighborhood had been converted to pollinator habitat. The local ecosystem, which had been nearly sterile, came back to life. Sarah's story repeats across the country. Individual homeowners creating pollinator habitat in their yards, urban communities building rooftop gardens, schools replacing ornamental landscaping with educational pollinator gardens. Each garden supports bee populations in its immediate area. But when you have thousands of these efforts connected across a landscape, they create corridors that allow bee populations to move, breed, and recover from local disasters. The science behind why these efforts work is surprisingly straightforward. native plants support 30 times more pollinators than exotic species. Plants that bloom in succession provide continuous food sources rather than boom and bust cycles. Diverse plant communities support diverse bee communities, which are more resilient to diseases and environmental stresses. A single garden with succession blooming, crocuses in March, wild bergamot in July, asters in October, can support 15 bee species throughout the growing season. Scale that up to neighborhood level, and you create habitat that rivals what existed before agricultural conversion. Even small actions have disproportionate impacts. That patch of weeds you're tempted to mow might be the only food source for specialized bees within miles. The dandelions in your yard that annoy you aesthetically are crucial early season food for bees emerging from winter dormancy. But individual actions, while necessary, aren't sufficient. We need policy changes that address the systemic causes of pollinator decline. The European Union banned neonicotinoid pesticides in 2018 after concluding that they posed unacceptable risks to bees. Within 2 years, bee populations in EU countries began recovering. The ban proves that policy changes can work quickly when they address root causes. Some US states are following suit. Maryland became the first state to ban neonicotinoid use by homeowners in 2018. Oregon has implemented similar restrictions, but federal action remains limited by agricultural lobbying and political gridlock. Agricultural subsidies offer another lever for change. Currently, the US government pays farmers billions of dollars annually to grow commodity crops in monocultures that provide little pollinator habitat. Redirecting even a small percentage of those subsidies toward pollinator-friendly farming practices could transform agricultural landscapes. The Conservation Reserve Program already pays farmers to take environmentally sensitive land out of production. Expanding this program to include pollinator habitat could create millions of acres of bee-friendly landscape while maintaining farm income. But we're racing against time in ways that should keep you awake at night. Climate change is accelerating the disruption of pollinator-plant relationships. Each year of delay makes recovery more difficult as ecosystems shift and species are lost. We're losing bee species faster than we can study them, let alone protect them. Franklin's bumblebee, once common along the Oregon-California border, hasn't been seen since 2006. The rusty-patched bumblebee, which used to be found across the eastern United States, has declined by 90% in 20 years. The yellow-banded bumblebee has disappeared from most of its historic range. Each extinct bee species represents the loss of specialized pollination relationships that took millions of years to evolve. When Franklin's bumblebee went extinct, so did its unique ability to pollinate certain wildflowers in its habitat. Those plants can still reproduce through other pollinators but less efficiently, which means their populations decline too. It's a cascade of losses that accelerates over time. Fewer bees mean fewer plants. Fewer plants mean fewer bees. The system doesn't just decline, it unravels. But here's what gives me hope, and what should motivate all of us to act. We know what works, and it's not too late. Unlike climate change, which requires massive global coordination and technological innovation, saving bees requires actions that individuals, communities, and local governments can take immediately. You don't need to wait for international treaties or technological breakthroughs. You can start making a difference this weekend. Plant native flowers in your yard. Support organic farmers at your local market. Vote for candidates who prioritize environmental protection. Pressure your city council to adopt pollinator-friendly landscaping policies. Join or create community gardens that include pollinator plants. Each action seems small, but they add up to landscape-level change that can reverse population declines and restore the ecological relationships that support both bees and humans. The choice is ours, and we're making it right now through thousands of individual decisions. Every time you choose to plant flowers instead of grass, buy organic food instead of conventional, support environmental candidates instead of industry-backed ones, you're choosing which version of the future we get. We can choose Maya's world, HEO, brown springs, monotonous diets, simplified landscapes, and the permanent loss of the biological diversity that made Earth beautiful. That's the path we're on right now. Or we can choose a different ending, one where the ancient partnership between flowers and bees continues, where spring still means colour returning to the world, where children grow up knowing the taste of strawberries and the sight of wildflower meadows. The bees are waiting. The flowers are waiting. The question is, what are we going to do while we still have time to choose? Because this isn't just about saving bees. It's about saving the world that made us human, abundant, diverse, beautiful, and alive. And that world is disappearing faster than most people realize. But it's not gone yet. And that means there's still time to act. The question is, will we?